Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and in addition to podcasting, I'm a leadership coach, a mastermind facilitator, a best-selling author, and a speaker. Yes, indeed, I love taking these nonprofit leadership topics on the road or into your Zoom room. If you need somebody at your next conference or perhaps a workshop, check out my new speaking page at pattonmcdowell.com for more information. Well, I had another fantastic conversation in this episode with Jacob Harold, who brings a remarkable array of experiences to his current philanthropic leadership, notably serving as president and CEO of GuideStar and as the co-founder of Candid, which was the merger of GuideStar and the Foundation Center. Of course, through these various lenses, Jacob has seen nonprofit leadership at its best and sometimes in its less than transparent shadow side that can taint the entire sector. Of course, I know as a listener of this podcast, you want to make a genuine impact on your community through philanthropic work, and Jacob is a perfect resource toward that end. In fact, one of the many topics we discussed was a preview of his fantastic new book called The Toolbox. And as the title implies, it is full of practical advice that can help your nonprofit leadership, especially if you want to do a better job enacting social change. Well, lots of reasons to check out the show notes for this episode. It's number 193. Just go to the podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com and you will find all of the resources Jacob and I discuss, as well as more information on Jacob and the work he's doing across our sector, and especially how you can get a copy of the Toolbox and the associated workbook. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Jacob Harold. Jacob, thank you for joining me on the path.
Patton, I'm thrilled to be here today.
Well, I am thrilled as well. Excited about this conversation. You've had a wonderful leadership journey in the philanthropic sector. You have written a fantastic book, which I know our listeners need to check out. And in fact, that might be a good place to start. We'll unpack it completely over the course of this conversation. But your book called The Toolbox, Strategies for Crafting Social Impact, makes perfect sense. But I would suggest, Jacob, that a lot of our nonprofit friends, they think they have social impact amongst their chief objectives, but I'm not sure they know exactly what it means and how to move that needle. So maybe start with that. What is social impact to you, and how can we measure it?
Sure. Well, I'll start with a slightly different definition and then get to the definition of social impact, which is the definition of social change, which I define in the book as work to make a better world. And you can even unpack each of those words. The work is something that is active. That better is different from what it might have been otherwise, and that world is that which is outside of you. And then, to me, social impact is the results of that work. And I think it's important to note that that is relative to the counterfactual, which is to say, if you didn't exist, if you didn't do that work, what would have happened? And the social impact is the difference between what actually happened and what would have happened without you. And that may sound abstract, but I think that actually each of those elements is important for people working in nonprofits or social businesses or government trying to make a better world, to really figure out how it is their actions that are oriented outside of them can really make a difference. The question of measurement, though, is far more complicated. That's something we can really dive into because it really depends on what the nature of the work is.
Right.
Some things are easy to measure. If you're distributing backpacks to kids who need them, you can count that pretty easily. But if you're trying to shift the public conversation around human rights, if you're trying to alter the structure of an economy to make it less polluting, it's a lot more difficult. And people in the social sector often struggle with the question of measurement. And luckily there are lots of people working really hard to try and solve that problem. But it's never going to be something where there's always an easy answer.
Yeah, well put. And of course, your book lifts up examples of organizations that have tried to move the needle, but you're right. So many of the time horizons, especially in a more complex nonprofit organization, you're not going to see immediate impact. But I love your example of the counterfactual. seems to me that's a great thing to consider in a staff or board retreat for a nonprofit organization. Like, what if we went away?
Yeah.
Right. That, and I'm guessing you've seen examples of that, or in fact, would you suggest that is a good question maybe to pose as a literal takeaway from this conversation?
I mean, absolutely. I think it's a very powerful question to pose, and for many reasons. One, because it may well be that you will see just how terrible things would be without you. Like that you're able
Right.
to better understand the value. It can give you confidence and inspiration. Or it might be that you discover that your organization has done the good that you set out to do, and that now is a time to pivot or to dissolve yourself so your resources can go elsewhere. Or you might find that you really struggle to answer that question, which may mean that there's a lack of clarity about what you're trying to accomplish or your strategy, and that can be helpful as well. So in all those scenarios, just asking that question, what would the world be like without us? You know, it's a Wonderful Life question from
Right.
that old movie, is actually really helpful, I think, for nonprofit strategy.
Couldn't agree more. And the first of what I know will be many takeaways for our nonprofit leaders who are listening. So again, Jacob, grateful for that. Before we fully unpack the book and the content therein, how'd you get into this stuff? How did you get into the philanthropic sector? And I do happen to know that you grew up in a family of nonprofit leaders, but maybe you could speak to that and how it shaped the work you're doing even now.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up not too far from you. I grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and my parents were nonprofit leaders a bit later in their career, and I'll get to that. But I'll just start with the sort of moral foundation they gave me with a little story, which is that when I was 2 or 3 years old, like any kid that age, I would run and trip and fall and scrape my elbow or bump my nose on the ground, and my mom would scoop me up and she'd kiss me and make sure I was okay. And then she would physically carry me back to the spot where I fell and direct our attention to that spot on the ground and ask me, let's check to see if the ground is okay. And that was her parenting trick in a way to distract me from passing pain. But it really was much deeper than that. It was also her trying to teach me and my sister to expand our circle of compassion and to think about what does it mean to care for those things that are beyond us, even if it's just a scrap of land. And that ethos played out in my parents' careers. My mom started as a preschool teacher, but then later worked at an AIDS hospice, and then at our Catholic church, doing outreach. My dad ran Catholic Social Services for Central North Carolina, and then helped to lead some other organizations as well, serving people who were recently coming out of the criminal justice system. And so some of the conversations we'd have around the dinner table were about how hard it was to find funding, or how do you deal with your board. What was the experience of working with clients that day. And so it was sort of the family business. There just wasn't, there was no money to inherit, but it was the family business. And, so it very much was, built into my upbringing. And so I knew that I wanted to try and do something useful to the world as I grew up. But I also, everybody has to rebel. And so my rebellion was, against their local focus. And, so I ended up focusing on national and global issues. It's kind of pitiful as rebellions go, but it was all I could come up with.
Well, so was it an early stage? Again, I'm encouraged by the number of emerging leaders in the nonprofit sector. As you well know, more and more universities are offering programs in nonprofit management, undergraduate and graduate level. Was it clear to you as a college student that the nonprofit or philanthropic leadership would be your career path?
So not exactly. It was clear to me that doing something useful for the world was going to be part of my career path. But in college, I got distracted by a number of different academic pursuits and some political activism, and so I started to see the world through more of a maybe abstract and more of a political lens.
Right.
And so my first nonprofit job was in grassroots organizing around environmental issues. So it wasn't nonprofits per se, but it was the work that nonprofits do. But I think I had an inkling, at least in college, that a lot of the most important work for social good happened in the nonprofit sector, but not all of it. That there were people doing social change work that was really powerful in the business world, in government, and even, and of course in community without the, legal structure of a nonprofit organization. So I started to see that there was this apparatus that humanity had built to try and make the world better, and that it existed across sectors. But that, for me, most of my time has been in the nonprofit world, and that's where I think a lot of the lessons have been learned. And I think, one opportunity that those of us in the nonprofit sector have is to figure out how to share what we've learned with our colleagues in other sectors in a way that that actually helps them be more effective. Now, it's tricky to do that in a way that's not condescending. I think many of us in the nonprofit sector have felt a version of that condescension coming from the business world when it comes to some operational, financial, managerial issues. And we don't want to replicate that. But I do think we can be proud that we've learned a lot, and that especially as questions of social impact become more and more integrated into business strategy, that there's a lot that we can share and teach to our friends who are in the marketplace.
More of a level playing field, isn't it, in that regard? Yeah. Because you're right. There was, I think many our listeners are nodding right now at sometimes the condescension they feel, and we'll talk about that because you did a wonderful job of unpacking issues like the overhead myth campaign. But before we do that, I guess GuideStar, of course, you served as CEO for almost a decade, I believe, and talk about that. How did that come about for you as a professional stop? And, how would you describe, frankly, the state of transparency, which GuideStar did such a good job of lifting up?
Well, my journey to GuideStar really started in my early career when I worked in the environmental movement. And, I had a chance to work for several different organizations and work with many others. And it quickly became clear to me that there were some pathologies that could be dealt with in the environmental movement. One was that organizations didn't do a great job of working with each other. There was just a lot more opportunity for collaboration. And then another was that the most effective organizations were not necessarily the ones raising the most money. So donors were actually not making the best use of their dollars in how they were distributing them. And so those questions started to percolate in my mind. And then during my time at Bridgespan and the Hewlett Foundation, I started to work in depth on some of these questions of what does it mean to have a system that works better? And that led me to GuideStar, where I had been serving on the board. And, it was such a privilege to be able to be in that perch of, when we started having, on the order of 6 million users, and this position to sort of define what was important, at least for all those users. And one thing we saw is that if you looked at the GuideStar profile page for a given nonprofit, when I started, the biggest single chart was a chart with overhead and fundraising ratios. Now, if you talk to the folks at GuideStar, they would offer a very nuanced point that was one data point. It didn't really tell you anything about the actual effectiveness of the organization. But through a graphic design choice, through a user interface choice, we were raising up the idea that this was the most important piece of information about a nonprofit's performance. Right. So we immediately took it down, and then started to think about other kinds of information, and we can talk about that. But then we also realized that other colleague organizations like Charity Navigator or the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance were doing similar things. They were raising up this data point, even though they knew, and they would say that it wasn't the most important piece of information. So, I got together with my colleagues who were the heads of those two organizations, and we wrote a letter called The Overhead Myth to the donors of America saying, hey, we're sorry that we've been promoting this. We're not saying it's meaningless, but it is not the most important thing. And you should understand that when you're making a decision about giving, there are a lot of other things that matter more than an overhead ratio. And I feel like that battle is not over, but that we've made some real progress in shifting the public conversation about that, the way that journalists talk about that issue, and the way that many, although certainly not all donors, think about what really matters when you're looking at a nonprofit.
Yeah, I'm so glad you did. And I recall, Dan Pallotta's
Hmm.
noteworthy TED Talk and others that have tried to lift this up. But I guess I get it. And of course, as a former nonprofit leader and fundraiser, it was the bane of sometimes of our conversational existence, right? That the donor wants their money to go, quote, to the program, to literally be impacting those that you serve. But yeah, how did you counter that? I guess were there certain headlines that you used to help counter, which I still think exists, right?
Hmm.
That donors go crazy if there's some what they believe is an exorbitant salary of a nonprofit leader, for example. But how did you counter some of those kind of understandable arguments?
Sure. Yeah. And one was to admit fully that there is fraud. There are scoundrels in the nonprofit sector. There aren't very many of them. It's a very tiny proportion by all the data that I've seen. But I do think it's important to acknowledge when donors fear that there are a few out there that you want to avoid. And a
Right.
metaphor we would often use is the process of picking a restaurant to go to. That you want to look at the sanitation rating of a restaurant. And if it says C, you don't want to go there. But most people are not paying that much attention because most restaurants have perfectly fine sanitation. They're paying attention to the review by the food critic or the reviews on Yelp or what their friends have told them or what the restaurant looks like or how it smells as you walk by. There are so many other pieces of information you can use to decide where to go out to eat. And so, the overhead ratio is maybe like a sanitation rating,
Right.
occasionally useful to weed out a few bad guys, but it's not going to tell you where you're going to have a delicious and meaningful experience with great service and great ambiance.
Love that analogy. And in fact, it leads to, I guess, a follow-up question of, so nonprofit leaders listening, you would encourage them still to demonstrate that they have financial controls in some of the things, I guess, the scoundrels have abused. But is there anything else in terms of advising how I tell my story as a nonprofit leader that perhaps helps not perpetuate the overhead myth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think it's fine to share that information. But, if you look at, and this is still true, unfortunately, at many nonprofit annual reports, you'll look at the back and the nonprofit will themselves be reinforcing the overhead myth by having the biggest data point be their overhead ratio or their
Yep.
fundraising ratio.
Yep.
It's fine to share that information. You don't have to hide it, but you need to provide other data points that are meaningful. Now, those could be financial. They could be about growth rate over time, or they could be about cost per impact. It's going to depend on your organization's model. But you just have to offer something else so that that data point is put in context. And then, even more importantly, I would argue, is the programmatic data. Whatever it is that you believe is an appropriate way to tell your story with numbers about the impact that you're creating or the progress you're making towards that impact. And this gets to something at GuideStar we talked about, the two laws of nonprofit communications. The first law is no stories without numbers, and the second law is no numbers without stories. That
Yes.
we really need to have both, and that they complement each other in really powerful ways. And if the only way you're selling your program is through stories, then those donors who are number focused are going to only be able to look at the financials, and they may get stuck on that. And similarly, if you just provide this dry recitation of numbers without the narrative about the story beneath it all, then you may not inspire people, and you simply need both. And I think a lot of nonprofits are getting better about that. And I do believe that platforms like GuideStar, which now is part of the organization Candid that I helped to start, provide a framework for nonprofits to tell their story, to provide a written description of goals and strategies, to provide whatever quantitative metrics you think are appropriate, to bring in other important data points like the demographics of your staff, opinions of users, et cetera. And that those sort of platforms can really help not just tell your story to donors, but help to clarify your own thinking. And I can't tell you how many times I would be out on the road speaking when I was head of GuideStar, and someone would come up to me afterwards and say, "Well, our nonprofit just finished the process of filling out our whole profile. We got a platinum seal of transparency." And then they would always first say, "Man, it was a lot of work. It was a pain in the butt." And then they would say, "And it was so worth it for how much it clarified our own thinking." And that was great. The group that I liked even more, though, were those nonprofits that said, "Oh yeah, it was really easy to fill it out because we had already figured all that stuff out."
Yes.
I
Yes.
mean, those were really my favorite, but I like the other category too because it showed that the process of being transparent actually could make you better.
Well, it's fantastic advice and practical. And again, I love the analogy you use of the numbers behind the stories and the stories behind the numbers. That again seems to me to be a practical way to break down our own organization's impact in ways that can be graphically and I guess textually shared. And I know we'll link to some of these resources, Jacob, that you're going to share with us as well. As you look back on that, the state of transparency in the nonprofit sector, obviously you elevated it in a very good way, but I wonder now that you look back as you've moved beyond that literal leadership state, how do you think things are now?
I mean, I do think they're much better, and they're better for a number of reasons. I think journalists are doing a better job. I think nonprofit leaders have built enough confidence to push back on donors who have overly simplistic frameworks. I think the fact that you have data standards like those provided by GuideStar has helped create a bit of order that's actually revealed diversity. An important thing with GuideStar was we were humbled, and I'll tell a quick story on this. I once, while I was at GuideStar, was having lunch with a friend who worked at Google, and I was bragging about our user numbers, which was not a good idea because we have 6 million users every year, and my friend smiles and says we have 6 million users every minute.
Wow.
And it was just a very humbling reminder that what feels like scale can sometimes actually be very small, and that led us to build a series of partnerships with some of these big tech platforms. And these tech platforms have had a mixed impact on our society, no doubt, but they are how people get information. And now Google and Amazon and Facebook are getting data in bulk from Candid in order to enrich their own provisions, because that's where most people are operating. And I think that has made a difference. I think there are movements like the effective altruism movement that have raised up the need for rigor in useful ways. They've also gone too far at times, in my judgment. I think we see that with the collapse of FTX and the controversy around Sam Bankman-Fried and his relationship to the effective altruism movement. But people have pushed the nonprofit sector in ways that I think have been helpful. And so we've still got a long way to go, but I think we're making real progress.
Certainly agree. And again, you should be justifiably proud of what you've done to impact this topic. And frankly, the conversation that has shifted, I believe, in a positive way. Work to be done, as you note. But I'm guessing all of these topics swirling around in your head maybe were part of, hey, I'm going to write a book about this. But let's talk about that. The book, The Toolbox, again, Strategies for Crafting Social Impact, is a wonderful read. Why'd you write it? Well, talk about the origin story, if you would, of the book itself.
Sure. Yeah, so I mentioned that after college, I worked in the environmental movement, and I worked with a lot of folks who were community organizers who really thought that change happens when people at a community level come together and build power as a group. And I thought, yeah, that makes total sense. That sounds very effective. But then they would sometimes go to the next level and basically say, and that's the only way to make change. And then I thought, wait, that doesn't seem right. That seems like a very powerful way to make change, but not the only one.
Right.
And then I went to business school, and people would say, well, markets allow impact to scale. They make it easier to get capital. They align incentives. I thought to myself, that makes sense. That seems like a really powerful way to do things. And then they would say, and it's the only way to do it. I'd say, what are you talking about? It's not the only way. Then I was privileged to be at the Hewlett Foundation, where every day social change leaders from around the world would come talk to us about their unique approach to doing good. And it was so amazing. But then some of them, not all of them, but some of them would say, and this is the only way. And so I, on the one hand, was just so struck by the abundance of ways of thinking about doing good and what a wonderful resource that was. But I was also kind of frustrated by those folks who just picked one and kind of used that one at the expense of all the others. And so the toolbox was meant to be at least a partial solution to that problem, to say, look, here are 9 different tools, 9 ways of thinking about social change, including community organizing and including markets, but also including mathematical modeling and storytelling and design thinking and institutions and others. And that, we can actually, it's possible to, in a dozen pages, highlight the essential lessons of each of those tools. And that then someone has a toolbox. And so, there was a bit of frustration that drove me to do this, but there was also just this excitement about the abundance of ways of thinking about doing good that the world has offered us.
Well, I think it's fantastic. Of course, I want to encourage you, though, our listeners, as you know, they're current nonprofit leaders. They want to be in nonprofit leadership. I guess there's both an educational value to this reading, or what are some of the other, I guess, benefits you would suggest for someone listening to read the book?
I sort of jokingly described it, and this is in the book, as half textbook and half pep rally. In that, it is meant to be very instructive, but also to be inspirational. And it's not that I'm inspirational; it's that the stories that are in this book are inspirational. It's that the words that are in the book, can remind us of why we do this work and provide that extra bit of energy that we need to get through that hard day or that challenge in the office or whatever it may be. And so part of how I tried to do that in partnership with a design firm was to make the book itself multidimensional. And by that, I mean, it's full color. And it is full of diagrams and photography and poetry and equations and stories, different ways of presenting information to reach different styles of learning, because all of us learn in different ways. And I think one challenge that a lot of sort of how-to books sometimes fall down on is that it's just a wall of text.
Yes.
And that's just not how everyone learns.
You've provided the variety, which indeed I think makes it more compelling and more engaging. And that's what I, again, would lift up. In fact, I think too, Jacob, you've developed a field guide associated with the book, or talk about that and how it interplays with the book itself.
Yeah. So the field guide is this 41-page document that I made with some advisors of mine, and it is, you could call it a glorified worksheet, but it's a little more than that. But right. Where there's an opportunity to, as a companion to the book, for a reader to take an issue that they're working on or a program they're running, and run it through the filter of each of the 9 tools that I go through in the toolbox, and to draw a little picture or write a little description through this field guide, which is meant to be printed out and written all over. And that's available on the website jacobharold.com. Because it is often so easy when you read a book to kind of stop there and not take that next step of application. And I hope the field guide can help with that. But I also think that part of the reason why it's important to share these 9 tools is just to seed our mind for some future problem, just to put the language and the ideas somewhere deep in our unconscious, so that when the time comes when we need them, they're there and they're ready for us. And that so much of learning, it turns out it's hard to apply right then, but it turns out to be really useful a little bit down the road.
Well, and Jacob, you've got wonderful examples you've seen up close, and in your research, you've studied lots of organizations. I wonder, is there an example that you might share of an organization that I guess had meaningful impact on the social impact front, or maybe best illustrates some of your teaching?
Sure. I'll give a couple sort of examples briefly. One is one that everyone knows about, which is Wikipedia. And it's easy for us to forget that Wikipedia is a nonprofit, or particularly it's a project of a nonprofit called the Wikimedia Foundation. And that, this incredible aggregation of human knowledge, we owe to the nonprofit sector. And it is a very interesting combination, in my mind, of 2 tools, or insights from 2 tools. So one is behavioral economics, that in Wikipedia, they figured out how to tap into that human desire to share knowledge, to refine knowledge, to present it in a clear way, which is a desire that not everyone has, but a lot of people do. And that desire that people have to be recognized for their contributions to a shared effort. So Wikipedia capitalizes on these insights into human behavior, but then also it is an example of the creation of an enduring institution. And that's the last tool that I talk about in the book, is institutions. And the creation of a pattern of relationship that exists over time and that is self-reinforcing and stable, and one that, unlike many other organizations, I think there's a true justification for Wikipedia to try and exist forever. And that I just think it's a great example of bringing together different insights to create something new. Another example I'll give is an organization I used to work for, Rainforest Action Network, which is a very aggressive environmental group that works on a number of issues, but mostly to protect rainforests, and was interested in how to change the behavior of logging companies. And they started to pressure and protest against the logging companies, and basically very little happened, because the logging companies kind of didn't have to care about what was happening outside of their headquarters. And Rainforest Action Network started to think more deeply about, well, what do they care about? What is the market context that they're operating within? They realized, well, what they really care about is what their customers think.
Yeah.
And their customers are companies like Home Depot or Lowe's. And Lowe's care about what is happening outside of their stores, because they know that could affect foot traffic. And the organization was able, with some targeted work, to really put the pressure on the customers, to have them put the pressure on the pulp and paper and logging companies. And then similarly, to put pressure on the banks and investors who were providing the capital for these companies. And so really thinking strategically about the marketplace. But then Rainforest Action Network did something else that I think was really important, which is, it was not just a bunch of grubby activists. They were ready, once these companies were ready to come to the table and talk about solutions, to put on a suit and go talk to them, have a serious conversation. And once these companies started to do the right thing, which a lot of them did, to celebrate that.
Yes.
To take out a full page out of the New York Times and say, this company did the right thing, thank you. And so that you don't only have an oppositional sort of relationship. So I find that an inspiring example as well.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic example. And you're right. It doesn't necessarily, you don't have to be a permanent antagonist, right? Even if your cause requires some antagonism to get attention, but they turned it around, and hopefully that builds a positive bond going forward. And I'm imagining that translation to any organization. Sometimes you're faced with challenges. You've got to be proactive, but it may be something that can be more unifying in the long run if it's done well. And I love that example for that reason. Back kind of the educational component of the book, at least in my opinion, you talk about some of the social change agents have to navigate certain behavioral norms. In fact, I think you identify 10 different biases that can impact this navigation. But maybe you could talk about what that is in general, and maybe a few examples as well.
Sure. There's been extraordinary work done in the discipline of psychology over the last more than a century. And then, in more recent years, there's been the emergence of cognitive science, in particular neuroscience, and then also the use of tools from economics to better understand human behavior, what's called behavioral economics. And you put all this together, and there's just been incredible insight into how the human mind actually works. Not just what we believe or think, but what we actually do. Each person is different, but there are some general patterns that are worth paying attention to. I'll, mention a couple of these cognitive biases. One is the concept of social proof, that people look around them to decide what behavior is acceptable. We've seen, for example, I'll give an example here, shifts in consumer behavior in terms of electricity consumption when you provide people information about how much energy their neighbors are using. Another bias is the what's called the sunk cost bias. I think we all know the idea of sunk cost, money you've already spent or time you've already spent. And that, once it's spent, it's gone. And yet we still tend to really value that. And that sometimes leads us to stick with a decision or an approach that's clearly not working anymore. There's the concept of risk aversion, which is, and this is pretty well established, that it hurts us more to lose something than it feels good to gain it. So,
Right.
The negative impact of losing $10 is greater than the positive impact of getting $10. That explains, I think, how, at least in part, caution. And there's sometimes very good reason for caution. And I wouldn't, and these biases come from times in human history when you really had to be careful. That if you lost that little bit of extra food you were saving, you might die. And so it's pretty rational. And that's actually an important thing about all these biases, is that there's a history to them that often makes total sense. But we do have to rethink how it operates in the modern world, and in particular in the context of social change.
Yeah, great examples. And I guess it leads me to a follow-up in terms of an understanding of these biases. Obviously will help a nonprofit leader in multiple ways, but you've seen a lot of great nonprofit leadership in action. Is it fair to say that those of the best leaders you've observed kind of have that sensitivity to the psychology of these 10 biases, or is that something, again, an aspiring nonprofit leader ought to shoot for?
So I've definitely seen that many times. But one thing I should say is that there are these nine tools in the book, and I certainly don't expect anyone to be a true expert in all of them. It's not that this is a threshold that you have to cross in order to be an effective nonprofit leader. What I do think is important is to have a familiarity with a range of ways of thinking, and to bring at least a couple different ways of thinking to your regular work. I think it's super helpful to know these biases, but I also think that someone who was a master of 3 of these tools might be just fine. What worries me are folks who are coming in with just pure instinct, not drawing on the lessons of decades or hundreds of years of work to make the world better, or who are so stuck in their one frame that they have such a narrow approach that they're bound to fail against the complexity of the world. But all that said, yes, I think it's very helpful, and I've seen many times that nuance around how the human mind works is really important. Not just for direct service nonprofits trying to help people on an individual level struggling with whatever barriers they're facing in society, but we had to think about this at GuideStar as we thought about how do you present information in a way that people can absorb, that can guide their decision making, but that doesn't overwhelm them.
Yes.
And that was a very practical question that we had to deal with, on a regular basis.
Good leadership lesson for sure. In fact, and of course, I'm thinking anyone listening to this podcast is a lifelong learner, so they will embrace your encouragement to learn about the tools. Don't be stuck in the mindset that perhaps you have had previously. Be a growth mindset type person. In fact, let's tease our listeners, Jacob, a bit with some of the tools. You've got 9, all of which have great merit. Are there a couple you might lift up as examples of tools that nonprofit leaders could absolutely employ?
Sure. I'll mention a couple others, and we've touched on some of them on the way. But one I'll mention, which is the first one, is storytelling. And storytelling is a human impulse that's been around for hundreds of thousands of years. But to connect it to the nonprofit sector, I'll pull out a word that you used before, Patton, which was antagonist. And in the Rainforest Action Network example, there was this antagonist. And I just think it can be so incredibly valuable when thinking about social change strategy to identify who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist. And you can go beyond that and think of other sort of roles that you often see in stories: the mentor, the friend, the henchman. There are lots of them. But let's focus on protagonist and antagonist. Then on the protagonist, it's easy to fall into the assumption that you are the protagonist. But I think it's worth really challenging that. And maybe the hero in the story is the person you're trying to serve. Or if you're trying to raise money, maybe at least in that conversation, the hero in the story is the fundraiser. Or maybe the hero in the story is the corporate executive you're trying to influence. And they're the one who has to go through a journey of with challenges and with self-understanding to get to a better place. And then similarly, with the antagonist, is the antagonist truly some evil corporation. Sometimes it is, but more often it's just the antagonist is the situation. The bad guy is the status quo.
Right.
Or maybe you're the antagonist. Maybe you have to figure out how to transform yourself in order to be more effective. And so just beginning to apply some of these basic concepts from storytelling begins to reveal, I think, some of the complexity that we see, and sometimes provides real strategic insight. So that's one. And then another one I'll mention is it's sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum, and it's mathematical modeling, which to many people in the nonprofit sector, they feel very comfortable with that. They love numbers. Others feel much less comfortable.
So. Right. Counting myself in that category, at least early on.
And in order to sort of address that, I start that chapter with a poem, and it's a poem about the Holocaust, and it's a very emotionally gripping poem by the Nobel Prize winner Wisława Szymborska, and it has this line, "History rounds off skeletons to zero," which is just reminding us that it's possible to lose a sense that we are actually counting individual lives. Or counting individual species or acres if we're working in the environmental movement, or pieces of art if we work in the art world. And that counting really matters, that there's moral power to counting. It's not just a dry and soulless activity. It actually is a way of giving dignity to those people that are, or things that are being counted. And so I think, we start from that, and then it's just more meaningful to think about, all right, well, how do we use addition and subtraction? How do we design a simple equation that captures what we're trying to do? How do we learn from statistics? And that we don't necessarily have to do that with perfect precision, but that there's real moral value to counting things and showing that they count.
Well, Jacob, I'm motivated by what you're saying, both for the perspective, or the new perspective I think it forces us to consider. Right. And again, maybe to your previous examples, these are tools that, first of all, allow us to step back and reimagine our organization, its impact, the story it tells. And those are the kind of things that I think give our listeners something really to play with in a new way. And perhaps attack something you describe very well, the complexity of today's social systems. For many nonprofit leaders, I think it feels just overwhelming to move the needle in those areas. And you alluded to this in our earliest part of the conversation, but I wonder, are there other words of encouragement you would offer someone who maybe isn't a smaller nonprofit, feeling like they're not moving the needle, but it would seem to me you've got suggestions that could help?
Well, first of all, I think it's to acknowledge that feeling that people have of being overwhelmed by the complexity of the modern world. And one dynamic that I think is really important in that is that the world has always been complex, but it is, I think, objectively true that it is changing faster right now. That the rates of change are increasing. We see this in the sort of basic stats of how we describe the world around pollution or energy use or population, information, amount of transportation, et cetera. And that, it just, the rate of change is enough to make anyone feel a little overwhelmed. And so I just honor that.
Yes,
and point. I think that's part of why we have to prepare ourselves right now with whatever tools we can find for the inevitable challenges that are coming ahead and the inevitable opportunities that are coming ahead. So, that's the first thing, is to honor it, and then to just begin to think about, all right, well, how do I prepare myself? At whatever point I'm in my career, how different might things be in 10 or 20 years? And what could I do now to be ready for that? And then in terms of this question of systems, there is a chapter on complex systems, and there's a whole science around that. But one important thing in that science is it gives you a basic language to think about how systems work, of the nodes of the system and the connections between them and the different types of feedback loops, all of which are actually pretty intuitive ideas that I think people see in their daily lives. But you might just need some words to describe them. And then it begins to allow you to break the system down into pieces and think about, what part of this can I address? And so, I think that language helps. I think that that sense of history helps. And then I think, just saying, what, it's hard. We're not about to solve all these problems all at once, but we can be really thoughtful about what we do to try and make things better.
It's fantastic, Jacob. All of this advice, and again, the encouragement. I think you never arrive at the ultimate in leadership in any sector, certainly not in nonprofit leadership. So your encouragement to be a lifelong learner, to accept the fact that change is inevitable, and that how do you kind of, again, build your toolbox so that you'll be as prepared as you can be. Thank you again for all of this advice and takeaways. Is there anything else, Jacob, as you ponder our listener who is aspiring or currently in a nonprofit leadership position? What advice would you have for them to, again, continue to encourage them to move forward?
One thing is to, stretch yourself, and, to say, what's the thing that I naturally turn my head away from? What's the part of my job that gives me an icky feeling in my stomach? And to just lean into it a little bit. Recognize that's probably not going to be your expertise. It's probably not going to be your strength, but it just stretches. It gives us a broader foundation. And, for someone who's highly quantitative, that could also just mean, hey, you should read some poetry. And, for someone who is really a storyteller, to say, you know what, I'm going to stop and I'm going to really think a little bit about science. I'm going to think a little bit about math. I'm going to go and talk to that person at my organization who I just used to think of as in charge of the numbers, and now I realize, they're in charge of counting, and that matters. And maybe I can learn something from them.
It's great advice, as I knew you would provide, and you have throughout this episode. So for that, I am grateful. Jacob, we're absolutely going to lift up your book and the many resources people can find at your website. Let me ask you, though, for another parting gift, if I might. Has there been another book that has been meaningful to you on your journey that you might recommend to our listeners?
The one that comes to mind for me is actually a novel called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And it's about basically a new ministry, a new UN ministry that's been put in charge of trying to address the climate crisis. And it takes place over the course of 20 years. And after 2 or 3 decades, they actually succeed. It's a book that has a happy ending, believe it or not, dealing with an issue that is often, cast in such dark terms. But a really important sort of lesson, and what makes it feel like a professional development book to me, is that there is no one thing that was done in that book that solves the problem. It was a combination of dozens and dozens of different strategies across thousands of organizations engaged by billions of people that eventually get humanity to a place with a stable climate. And that to me is actually it was inspiring, but it also totally embraces the messiness and totally embraces that, there's no magic bullet, but that people can still do work that really matters.
Fantastic addition to our wish list. As you and I are recording this, it's the end of 2022, but for those listening as it's released, this sounds like a book they might want to include on their 2023 goal sheet. And so, Jacob, again, thank you for that. What else would you like to encourage our listeners to do? Where can they find out more about you and the great work you're doing now?
Sure. So my website is jacobharold.com, or also craftingimpact.org. It goes to the same place. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I do a lot of my writing there. I've been doing some writing on Twitter over the years, Jacob C. Harold. We'll see if Twitter survives. I'm not sure about that. But I really do welcome your listeners' input and feedback and suggestions on, what are the tools that we should add to the toolbox? If I do another edition, what should the next chapter be? I'd love to hear from folks and draw from all the learning that's happening across the field right now.
Well, thank you for your contributions to the field again, Jacob, and thanks again for joining me on the path.
Absolutely. It's been great to be here.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jacob as much as I did and came away with some practical ideas that can guide you on your professional journey, especially if you and your nonprofit organization want to be more effective in creating genuine social change. Of course, I can think of no better way to be more effective at enacting social change is to get a copy of Jacob's book, and you can find through our show notes. Again, episode number 193 will connect you with Jacob himself and all of the resources and great content he's producing as a thought leader in our sector. As always, I would be most grateful if you would share this episode, just one other person, so they can also enjoy some of the content we're trying to produce. You can do that by going to the podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com, and there are multiple means through which you can share this episode or any other episode, as well as simply subscribing to this podcast. To subscribe, simply find the follow button on that same podcast page, and you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday. Of course, if you like this episode, click on the episodes button at the top of that same page, and you can scroll through thumbnails of some of our most popular episodes, as well as search by topic or guest name. Thanks again for all you're doing for the nonprofit sector, especially right now. And I hope you'll keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.